It is 11:58 in the morning. A Saturday. The city of Tokyo hums with the sound of midday life. Street vendors call out their prices. Children laugh in narrow alleyways. Pots of rice steam over charcoal fires in 10,000 homes across the city, because it is almost lunchtime, the meal that hundreds of thousands of families are in the middle of preparing right now. In Yokohama, just 40 kilometers to the south, ships idle in the harbor. Merchants count their goods. The smell of the sea mingles with wood smoke and salt air. No one knows. No one suspects. No one has any idea that in the next 60 seconds, everything they have ever known, every street, every home, every neighborhood, every life, is about to be obliterated. 11:58 and 44 seconds. The ground moved. Not gently. Not with warning. It moved the way the earth was never supposed to move, with a violence so sudden, so total, so absolute that for one terrible moment, every human being in the Kanto region had the same thought. This is the end of the world. To understand what happened on September 1st, 1923, you first need to understand the world that was destroyed. By the early 1920s, Tokyo was one of the great cities of Asia. With a population approaching 3 million people, it was an empire's capital, a city that straddled two worlds simultaneously. Ancient wooden temples and centuries-old neighborhoods sat side by side with modern brick banks, Western-style department stores, and electric tramlines that crackled and hummed through the streets. Japan was changing. Fast. The Meiji Restoration of the previous century had launched the country into an era of extraordinary modernization. Factories were rising. Universities were opening. A new middle class was emerging, hungry for progress, for Western fashions, for a different kind of future than their parents had known. And yet, underneath all of that ambition, underneath the telegraph wires and the modern storefronts, the bones of the city were ancient and fragile. The vast majority of Tokyo's buildings were made of wood, not out of ignorance, not out of poverty, but out of tradition, out of economy, out of a culture that had built this way for 1,000 years. The machiya, the traditional merchant's townhouse, was a marvel of craft and practicality. Built from timber, paper screens, and clay tiles, these structures were cool in summer, adaptable, beautiful. They were also, as the city's engineers quietly understood, extraordinary kindling. Tokyo in 1923 had grown so quickly, so relentlessly, that urban planning had never quite caught up with the population. Streets were narrow, some barely wide enough for two people to pass each other. Buildings were packed so tightly that a visitor from Europe or America would have been astonished by the sheer density of it all. Yokohama was a different kind of city, but no less vulnerable. As Japan's principal international port, it was home to a large foreign settlement, British merchants, American traders, Chinese workers, and its waterfront was lined with brick warehouses and Western-style commercial buildings. But inland, the pattern was the same. Densely packed wooden neighborhoods, narrow streets, and a population that had grown far faster than the infrastructure to support it. Beneath the beautiful, fragile city, tectonic forces had been building for decades. Japan sits at one of the most geologically violent spots on the planet, the junction of four major tectonic plates, where the Pacific Plate and the Philippine Sea Plate grind against the Eurasian and North American plates in a slow, relentless collision that has shaped the Japanese archipelago for millions of years. The Sagami Trough, a subduction zone that cuts beneath Sagami Bay, just south of Tokyo, had last ruptured in 1703. That earthquake had killed an estimated 37,000 people and triggered a devastating tsunami. It had been 220 years. The stress had been building. Slowly. Invisibly. Inevitably. Scientists at the Imperial University of Tokyo had warned that a major earthquake was overdue. Some had even predicted it would strike the region within a generation. But in a city growing as fast as Tokyo was, where every year brought new buildings, new businesses, new lives, it was easy to defer the fear. Easy to believe that the modern city was somehow different. Somehow safer. It wasn't. September 1st, 1923 fell on a Saturday. In Japan in 1923, Saturday was still a working day for most people, but it was also the day of the week when life moved a little slower. Markets were busier. Families lingered over meals. The city had a particular texture on Saturday mornings, a kind of domestic ease that made what was about to happen feel even more devastating in retrospect. The weather that morning had been difficult. A tropical storm had passed through the region the previous day, and its remnants still churned in the atmosphere. Strong, gusting winds that sent dust swirling through the streets and tugged at the paper lanterns strung between buildings. The skies were overcast. The air was thick and hot. At exactly 11 hours, 58 minutes, and 44 seconds past midnight, a rupture began. The rupture propagated at roughly 3 kilometers per second, tearing along a fault line nearly 130 kilometers long beneath the floor of Sagami Bay. In geological terms, it was over in moments. In human terms, it lasted forever. The first shock wave hit Yokohama at 11 hours 58 minutes and 44 seconds. Eyewitness accounts described the initial sensation not as shaking but as a kind of upward punch, as though the ground itself had been struck from below by something massive and furious. Buildings that had stood for decades lurched sideways. Brick facades peeled off like paper. The steel framework of the new Yokohama Customs House, a modern, Western-style building that had been completed just the previous year, buckled and groaned. Then the shaking began. In Tokyo, 4 to 5 seconds later, the same punch arrived. People who survived described it this way. One moment they were standing, sitting, cooking, walking, and the next moment the world had simply come apart. The floor tilted. The walls moved. The ceiling came down. There was no up or down anymore, no reference point, no solid ground. Just motion. Violent, disorienting, total motion. The shaking lasted between 4 and 5 minutes. That doesn't sound long. Read that number again. 4 to 5 minutes. Imagine standing in a room while it shakes, collapses, and tries to bury you alive. Not for 4 or 5 seconds. 4 or 5 minutes. It was an eternity. The Great Kantō Earthquake, as it would come to be known, measured an estimated magnitude of 7.9 on what we now call the moment magnitude scale. Its energy release was the equivalent of roughly 400 Hiroshima atomic bombs. In Yokohama, 60% of all buildings collapsed in the first shock. Entire city blocks, places that had existed for generations, were reduced to rubble in under 5 minutes. In Tokyo, the destruction was almost as severe. In the working-class districts of Honjo and Fukagawa, the dense, wooden neighborhoods east of the city's commercial center, block after block was flattened. The Imperial Hotel, designed by the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, would later become famous for surviving relatively intact, reportedly due to its flexible, floating foundation design. But the hotels, the offices, and the brick buildings of the Marunouchi district were the exception. In the neighborhoods where ordinary people actually lived, the earthquake had done its worst. But the earthquake was only the beginning. Here is the terrible arithmetic of the Great Kantō Earthquake. The earthquake itself was catastrophic. But the earthquake did not kill most of the people who died that day. Fire did. When the shaking began at 11:58 in the morning, hundreds of thousands of Tokyo families were in the middle of cooking their midday meal. Charcoal fires burned in iron braziers in kitchens across the city. Gas lines fed burners throughout the commercial district. In the dense wooden neighborhoods of Honjo and Fukagawa, nearly every household had an open flame burning at the exact moment the earthquake struck. In the chaos of the shaking, those flames escaped. Fires broke out in at least 130 different locations across Tokyo within the first hour. Under ordinary circumstances, Tokyo's fire brigades, which were actually quite well organized by the standards of the time, might have contained many of these fires. But circumstances were not ordinary. The earthquake had severed water mains across the city. Fire engines could not move through streets blocked by rubble. Communication lines were down. The brigade commanders had no way of knowing where to send their men or how many fires they were actually fighting. And then there was the wind. The remnants of the previous day's typhoon had left the region with strong, swirling gusts that shifted direction unpredictably. As individual fires grew and fed on the timber and paper buildings of the densely packed neighborhoods, those gusts carried embers ahead of the main front, igniting new fires in areas that had not yet burned, creating a situation that no fire brigade in the world could have controlled. The fires merged. Individual blazes combined into larger ones. Larger ones combined into district-wide infernos. And in the low-lying eastern neighborhoods of Honjo and Fukagawa, where thousands of people had fled the earthquake's destruction and gathered in open spaces, believing they were safe, those district-wide infernos combined into something that the world had rarely seen. A firestorm. A firestorm is different from an ordinary fire. In a firestorm, the heat generated by a massive blaze creates its own violent inward wind, a self-sustaining column of superheated air that draws oxygen in from all sides, feeding the flames to temperatures that melt metal, reduce concrete to dust, and make it impossible for any living thing within its radius to survive. The most devastating single event of the entire disaster, perhaps in all of modern Japanese history, occurred at the Army Clothing Depot in the Honjo district. By mid-afternoon on September 1st, roughly 40,000 people had fled to the open grounds of the clothing depot, believing that the wide, flat space would protect them from the collapsing buildings and the spreading fires. They brought what they owned, furniture, bedding, bundles of possessions on hand-pulled carts. They watched the fires burning around the depot's perimeter. They thought they were safe. The firestorm consumed the clothing depot in the late afternoon of September 1st. Of the approximately 40,000 people who had sought shelter there, fewer than 2,000 survived. Let that number rest for a moment. 38,000 people. Killed in a single afternoon. In a single open space that they had chosen precisely because it seemed safe. It remains one of the deadliest single events in modern history. Across the city, the fires burned for 3 days. 3 days. They burned through the night of September 1st, when the sky above Tokyo glowed red and orange so brightly that observers on ships far out at sea reported that the horizon itself appeared to be on fire. They burned through September 2nd, consuming district after district in the city's east and center. They burned into September 3rd, finally beginning to weaken only when they had run out of fuel, because there was simply nothing left to burn. When the fires finally died, more than 44 square kilometers of Tokyo, roughly 45% of the entire city, had been reduced to ash. In Yokohama, the destruction was even more complete. 80% of the city's buildings had been destroyed by earthquake, fire, or the tsunami waves that struck the harbor in the hours after the initial shaking. Yes, there was also a tsunami. In Atami, on the coast of the Izu Peninsula, a tsunami wave struck within minutes of the earthquake, reaching heights of nearly 12 meters in some locations. Along the coast of the Boso Peninsula, waves swept inland and destroyed fishing villages that had survived earthquakes before. The sea had joined the earth and the fire. The numbers, when they finally came, were almost incomprehensible. Approximately 105,000 people were confirmed killed or missing and presumed dead. More recent scholarship has revised some of these figures, but the broad scale remains staggering. Roughly 100,000 to 142,000 dead across the Kanto region, depending on the methodology used. Hundreds of thousands more were seriously injured. 1 million people were left homeless in Tokyo alone. Another 500,000 in Yokohama. 3.5 million people in the Kanto region were directly affected by the disaster in some way. Through the loss of a home, a family member, a livelihood, a neighborhood. The infrastructure of both cities was essentially gone. Water mains had ruptured across Tokyo. The electrical grid was destroyed. Gas lines burned openly in the streets. The city's rail network, which had only recently become one of the most modern in Asia, was twisted and buckled, tracks ripped from their beds by ground movements and buried under debris. Communication was impossible. The earthquake had cut telegraph and telephone lines throughout the region in the first seconds of shaking. 4 hours after the disaster, the government in Tokyo had almost no information about what had happened, and almost no ability to coordinate relief efforts. Reports that reached the imperial government were fragmentary, contradictory, and in some cases wildly wrong. The military was mobilized. But with roads destroyed, bridges down, and the rail network crippled, even getting organized help into the stricken areas was a massive logistical challenge. In the immediate aftermath, it was ordinary people who saved ordinary people. In the ash and rubble of what had been Tokyo's most vibrant neighborhoods, survivors organized themselves with remarkable speed. Neighborhood groups that had existed for generations as social institutions became, almost overnight, emergency relief committees. People shared food, shared water, shared whatever they had managed to carry out of the burning city. Foreign residents in the international settlement at Yokohama, British, American, Chinese, French, worked alongside Japanese survivors in the immediate chaos of the first hours. The American naval vessels anchored in Yokohama harbor became, within hours of the earthquake, impromptu relief ships, their crews going ashore to pull survivors from the water and the wreckage. It was, for a brief and shining moment, a story of pure human solidarity. But the disaster had also created something else. Fear. In the hours and days after the earthquake, as the fires still burned and the scope of the disaster became clear, something deeply troubling began to happen in parts of Tokyo and Yokohama. Rumors spread. In the chaos of a destroyed city, with no functioning communications, with tens of thousands of people displaced and traumatized and terrified, rumors filled the vacuum where information should have been. And some of those rumors were targeted specifically at the Korean minority community in Tokyo and Yokohama, a community of several tens of thousands of workers who had come to Japan as the country's economy had expanded. The rumors were vicious. And they were false. Unfounded claims spread, by word of mouth, and then with the terrible amplification of official channels, that Koreans had poisoned wells, set fires, and were preparing to attack Japanese survivors. Not a single one of these rumors had any basis in reality. But in the terrified, exhausted, grief-stricken atmosphere of the post-earthquake days, they spread with horrifying speed. In the days following the earthquake, vigilante groups, some organized, some spontaneous, attacked Korean residents in Tokyo and its surrounding areas. The violence was horrific. Estimates of the number of Koreans killed in this violence range from approximately 6,000 to over 10,000, though the exact figure remains a matter of historical debate. Chinese and other foreign residents were also targeted in some areas. Members of socialist organizations and labor activists were also targeted in the chaos, in some cases by military or police elements. This violence was not an accident of the disaster. It was a product of long-standing prejudice, social tension, and the willingness of some people in positions of authority to allow, and in some cases encourage, the spread of false rumors in a moment of national crisis. It remains one of the most tragic and deeply uncomfortable chapters in modern Japanese history. Successive Japanese governments have handled the memory of this violence with varying degrees of openness. In 2023, on the centennial of the earthquake, Japanese civil society organizations held memorials for the victims of this violence. Calls for a formal government apology and acknowledgement have continued in recent years. The earthquake killed without distinction. The violence that followed was a human choice. It is important to say that plainly. The Japanese government's response to the Great Kantō Earthquake was, in some ways, among the most ambitious disaster recovery operations the modern world had seen up to that point. Within hours of the earthquake, Prime Minister Yamamoto Ganahayo declared a state of emergency and martial law in the Tokyo and Kanagawa regions. Relief supplies were mobilized. The military was deployed for rescue and logistical operations. An emergency reconstruction commission was established within weeks of the disaster. The man who would become most associated with Tokyo's reconstruction was Home Minister Shinpei Goto, a visionary administrator who had previously overseen the modernization of Tokyo's infrastructure. Goto presented the government with an extraordinarily ambitious plan. Rather than simply rebuilding Tokyo as it had been, the disaster should be seen as an opportunity to create something entirely new. His plan called for wide, straight boulevards cutting through the previously labyrinthine street network. Parks and open spaces distributed throughout the city, serving both as amenities and as fire breaks. Modern, earthquake-resistant construction for public buildings. A reorganized city that could withstand the next major earthquake, whenever it came. The full go-to plan was never implemented. Cost, political opposition, and the sheer human complexity of relocating hundreds of thousands of people into a planned new city meant that the reconstruction that actually happened was considerably more modest than the plan that had been proposed. Much of Tokyo was rebuilt, in the areas that had burned, in a somewhat more organized fashion than before, but not the radical transformation Goto had envisioned. Still, The reconstruction was remarkable. Within 2 years of the earthquake, Tokyo was functioning again as a city. Within 5 years, it had largely been rebuilt, not identically to what had stood before, but substantially reconstructed, with wider roads in the worst affected districts, more brick and concrete in the commercial areas, and a physical layout that bore the marks of the disaster in its geometry. The earthquake also, crucially, changed how Japan thought about seismic risk. The earthquake accelerated the development of earthquake engineering as a scientific and practical discipline in Japan. Japanese engineers who had been studying seismic resistance for decades found that their work suddenly had urgent national significance. New building codes were developed. New standards for the construction of public buildings were adopted. The disaster also drove significant advances in seismological science. The earthquake's effects were so widespread and so thoroughly documented, by Japanese scientists, by foreign researchers, by military surveyors and newspaper reporters, that it became one of the most studied seismic events in history, providing data that shaped the understanding of earthquake mechanics for generations. Japan, in the decades after 1923, became the world's leading nation in earthquake preparedness, seismic engineering, and disaster response. It is not an overstatement to say that the tragedy of September 1, 1923 is embedded in the foundations of every earthquake-resistant building that stands in Japan today. 100 years have passed since the morning the earth opened beneath Tokyo and Yokohama. On September 1 every year, Japan observes Disaster Prevention Day, Bozai no Hai, in direct commemoration of the Great Kantō Earthquake. Schools run earthquake drills. Emergency response teams conduct exercises. Citizens review their disaster preparedness kits. The entire nation pauses to remember and to prepare. That practice, that national ritual of remembrance and readiness, is itself a legacy of 1923. Modern Tokyo is among the most earthquake-resistant cities in the world. Buildings are engineered to flex rather than shatter. Early warning systems can alert residents to incoming shaking seconds before it arrives, seconds that save lives. Emergency infrastructure is redundant and distributed, designed specifically so that the kind of total communication blackout that paralyzed disaster response in 1923 cannot happen again. None of that happened by accident. It happened because 105,000 people died on a Saturday in September 1923, and the country they lived in looked at that tragedy and decided, collectively, deliberately, over generations, that it would never be unprepared again. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, the most powerful earthquake in recorded Japanese history, which killed nearly 20,000 people and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster, demonstrated both the progress Japan had made and the limits of that progress. The earthquake-resistant buildings performed as designed. The death toll from the earthquake itself, while terrible, was far lower than 1923 proportionally. But the tsunami overwhelmed sea defenses that had been built on historical data that did not account for a wave of that scale. Japan learned again, and adjusted again. That is perhaps the deepest lesson of 1923. Not just that the earth is dangerous, but that the relationship between a civilization and the natural forces that surround it is never finished. Never settled. The preparation never ends. The learning never ends. The adaptation never ends. The Great Kantō Earthquake of 1923 did not just destroy 2 cities. It destroyed a world. It destroyed the world that those 3 million people had known, the streets they had grown up on, the houses their parents had built, the neighborhoods that had shaped their languages and their memories and their sense of who they were. From that destroyed world, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, another world was built. It was not the same world. It never is. But it was built by the same people, the survivors and their children, and their children's children, who chose, in the face of the most complete destruction imaginable, to continue, to rebuild, to remember, and to learn. The ground beneath Tokyo will shake again. That is not speculation. That is certainty. The tectonic forces that ruptured in 1923 are still there, still moving, still building pressure along the same fault lines. But the city that stands above those fault lines today, the city of 40 million people that sprawls across the Kanto Plain in one of the most densely populated urban regions on Earth, is a city that knows what is coming, and has spent 100 years preparing for it. That is what the Great Kantō Earthquake gave Japan, in the end. Not only grief, not only ash. It gave Japan the determination to be ready. And in a world where the ground can move without warning, on any ordinary Saturday morning, while the rice is still cooking over the fire, that determination is everything.